request to ask follow-up questions to the president in person.
Why does he refuse to sit down? The answer is increasingly, inescapably, because he's hiding something.
At the end of the day, what is the evidence to support these suspicions?
It's closer to the subpoena possibility. The president is on shaky ground.
William Barr will pledge to let Special Counsel Robert Mueller finish his report.
I'm going to ask him, do you trust Mr. Mueller to be fair to the president and the country?
The senators will want assurance that he will allow his report to be made public.
What more assurance can he give? He ought to have smooth sailing, considering what Democrats are demanding.
This is New Day with Alisyn Camerota and John Berman.
Good morning and welcome to your new day, and it is an historic day. The president has been under investigation for working on behalf of Russia, and this morning the man who will oversee that investigation will face questions from the Senate. Confirmation hearings begin shortly for President Trump's Attorney General nominee William Barr, who will oversee the special counsel probe. Barr is expected to say that he will allow the special counsel, Robert Mueller, to complete his work and to make its findings public. But Barr wrote a controversial memo last year where he concluded that a president cannot obstruct justice, at least in some cases. And we've just learned that Barr shared and even discussed that memo with the president's own lawyers.
Meanwhile, the president of the United States on the lawn of the White House yesterday was forced to utter the words, quote, "I never worked for Russia." Now, CNN has learned that the Trump legal team rejected a new request by the special counsel to question the president in person. A source tells us, quote, "Mueller is not satisfied." Joining us now is James Clapper. He's the former director of national intelligence. Good morning, Director Clapper.
Morning, Alisyn.
Okay, I want to get to those one-on-one meetings that President Trump had with Vladimir Putin in a moment. But first, there's a story in the New York Times this morning that talks about the president once again talking to his aides about trying to get out of NATO. His senior administration officials told the New York Times that several times over the course of 2018, Mr. Trump privately said he wanted to withdraw from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Current and former officials who support the alliance said they feared Mr. Trump could return to his threat as allied military spending continued to lag behind the goals the president had set. Your thoughts on getting out of NATO?
Well, at risk of putting two and two together and getting five here, if this was, in fact, a topic of discussion in these secret sessions between Putin and President Trump, that's really terrible. I mean, withdrawing from NATO, even discussion about the withdrawing from NATO, I think it would be disastrous for the security of the United States. This is not about the U.S. just protecting NATO, because the U.S. derives benefit from being forward deployed, and where our first line of defense is our own shore. And this would play into Putin's hands. This is a primary objective of Putin, is to drive wedges between and among the European countries and a wedge between Europe and the United States. So this would be, to me, a real disaster. NATO has been a bulwark for both us and Europe for 70 years, and to summarily and casually withdraw from it would be a disaster.
And Director, the reason that you're speculating about whether or not this was a talking point between President Trump and Vladimir Putin is because we have no idea. We have no idea. There's no official readout. There's no documents. He didn't brief his advisors and other officials in his administration. And so how concerned should Americans be that we have no idea on 5 separate occasions what President Trump spoke about with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think Americans should be very concerned about it. Here we're having these one-on-one meetings, several of them, and we have no idea what went on. And this is with, the leader of the arch adversary of the United States. And I think the rationale that this is to prevent leaks, really, to use the phrase, stretches credulity.
After a 2017 meeting with Vladimir Putin in Hamburg, Germany, President Trump reportedly took the interpreter's notes and swore him to secrecy. Have you ever heard of that happening before with any president?
I have not. I can't conceive of why there'd be a necessity for doing that. Translators are doing a linguistic thing, and that's why it's so important that you have other people there to take substantive notes about discussions and particularly commitments that are made and requests that are made in the course of a dialogue like that. And I just think it's really disturbing that we have apparently no real record of any of this dialogue.
So now Democrats on the House Intel Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee are considering subpoenaing the interpreter's notes. Good idea or bad precedent?
Well, it's both. It's a good idea, and of course, it does it would set a precedent for future exchanges between heads of state, and that's not good either. So we're kind of in a bad place here.
You were the director of national intelligence, the current director, Dan Coats. Do you think that he is attempting today to find out what the substance of those meetings were, and how can he do that?
Well, I have no idea, but and I have to be careful here, but I'll just say that you can glean snippets of insight into what transpired at meetings by virtue of gleaning some intelligence from, it's never comprehensive, at least in my memory. It rarely is. But you can gain some insight into what was discussed through intelligence sources by virtue of discussions by the other party. I don't know if that occurred here, but if it did, certainly D&I Coats would be aware of it.
Sorry, Director, somebody was talking in my ear. Were you saying that you think that D&I Coats can get it from Russia, since the only people in the room, at least in one of the meetings in Hamburg, was Vladimir Putin, President Trump, and Vladimir Putin's interpreter? Yeah,
I'll just say as a general observation that sometimes, not always, but sometimes you can glean through intelligence sources what transpired, at least in part, rarely comprehensively, but at least in part, what transpired at such meetings with another head of state. And that's probably all I ought to say about it. And if that were the case, and I don't know that it is, then certainly our intelligence community would have access and insight.
Director, give us the big picture here. In the last 72 hours, there have been so many, as usual, stunning headlines, though some of them seem to have risen to a different category for many people, including national security experts. In the past, say, 72 hours, what headline or what development reporting has gotten you most concerned? Well,
again, putting two and two together, maybe getting five, but if there was discussion at these meetings about withdrawing from NATO, I would find that very disturbing. I thought the 20-second or so comedy bit that Seth Meyers did was a very good, succinct portrayal of the history here. And what I find bothersome is when these revelations come out, as they continuously do, more and more, I think, the public gets jaded to this. And if you can imagine that just, what we've just heard in the last few days came out with no previous background, what a bombshell that these would be. But because of behavior and statements going back to the campaign, we seem to be somewhat calloused to this. And that, from a big picture standpoint, I find very disturbing.
It's such a great point, Director Clapper. Luckily, we have Seth Meyers keeping track of it all for us, because, as you know, the news deluge is overwhelming to so many people. Director Clapper, thank you. Always great to get your perspective on all
Thanks,
of this.
Alisyn.
John.
All right, joining us now, CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin and CNN political analyst David Gregory. Jeffrey, all of what we just heard is the backdrop for what takes place today in Washington, where both of you gentlemen are, which is the confirmation hearing for William Barr to be the next Attorney General of the United States. We learned within the last 24 hours, not only did Barr write this controversial memo saying that he did not think the president could be investigated for obstruction of justice under certain circumstances, but he shared that memo with the president's lawyers and discussed it with the president's lawyers. Is this like tantamount to a discussion of legal strategy with a defense team when you're about to get a job overseeing the prosecution?
Well, it's similar. In fairness, I think we should point out that, people who become cabinet members have political views and legal views on all sorts of subjects. I mean, John Ashcroft was Attorney General and he was a senator before that. What makes this unusual is that he was taking a position going to really extraordinary lengths. I mean, who sends a 19-page memo just out of the blue to people in the administration about an issue that he will have at least some supervision over, and taking the opposite position that Mueller has taken? So, it is not disqualifying, but it certainly suggests that one of the reasons that Barr was chosen, taken from, essentially out of long-term retirement into this job, is because he has at least some hostility to the Mueller investigation.
And so, David, when William Barr today says to the lawmakers, as he's expected to from his prepared remarks, no, I won't get in the way of the Mueller investigation. It must go to its logical conclusion. I won't stand in the way of it. It is legitimate. After he had said that the obstruction of justice investigation was not legitimate, in so many words, who are they to believe? Which William Barr?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think there's a consensus among Republican leaders that the leadership of the Senate and the minority leaders of the House, that Mueller ought to complete his work. But all you have to hang your hat on is the idea that if somehow the administration interferes or quashes part of that work or tries to keep the report, and this is important, whether that report ultimately gets to Congress and the public, and Barr has said he feels it should, that'll be a major area of questioning today. But all you've got to hang your hat on is his word that he's going to let it go forward. And as Jeffrey says, there's reasons to be suspicious about this. Look, Donald Trump wants a loyal attorney general. That's what he has said he wants. He wants loyalty, and that's not how it's supposed to work. Now, Jeff Sessions, to his credit, actually understood that the job was bigger than him and his own political loyalty. William Barr's got to pass that hurdle. I mean, he's someone with background in a previous administration and in Washington, but this kind of memo, taking this kind of position to this degree, is going to raise a lot of suspicion. And I don't know that they're going to get to the bottom of this in a hearing to everyone's satisfaction.
What will they get to the bottom of today, Jeffrey? This hearing, we should note, it'll be led by the new Senate Judiciary Chair, Lindsey Graham, who has all of a sudden, over the last year, become one of the president's chief defenders. And it includes some Democrats who are running for president, we think. Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar. Do you expect any sunshine at the end of this day to be shown on this investigation or William Barr?
Well, Barr has one big advantage, is that he has been Attorney General, and he was generally regarded as a good Attorney General under George Herbert Walker Bush. So it is not, he comes with the opposite of baggage. He comes with a good deal of credibility. But I think, at least the Democratic senators are going to be looking for something close to a complete guarantee that, notwithstanding this memo, he is going to let Mueller complete his work and release the report. I think, that is, the firing of Mueller, I think, really is pretty much off the table at this point. But the status of the report is really interesting and really important, and the Attorney General will have really almost complete discretion to release or not release some or all of the Mueller report. So that's something I'm going to be watching for.
And by the way, the important constituency are still Senate Republicans, right? If this thing goes all the way, if there's a damning report about obstruction of justice and whatever the ties are, if they exist between the president or his campaign and Russia, it will be for the House to drop articles of impeachment and for him to be tried in the Senate. So that's the bottom line. And whether Republican leaders actually lose their patience with Trump or worse is what the critical question is. And let me say one other thing. The history when it comes to law and order and this president is that he hasn't gotten what he's wanted. His guys at the FBI, his guy, I mean, no bigger guy than Jeff Sessions, his first supporter, was AG. And those guys have stood up for their institutions despite the hammering from this president. I think that says something about how the president wants stuff that he doesn't always get.
Right, or that when he does get what he wants, he then no longer wants it.
Well, right, there's that.
I mean, so Jeffrey, is there such a thing as a guarantee? I mean, if Bill Barr today promised, yes, of course I will make the report public or I'll give it to Congress, is that a guarantee?
Well, you have to trust his good faith on that. Once someone is confirmed in the cabinet, there's really no remedy except impeachment of the cabinet member, which effectively never happens. I think David makes the point about the Senate Republicans. There is no sign currently that any Senate Republicans are on the fence or against Barr. So Barr is going to get confirmed.
Right.
The question is what kind of concessions he will make to Democrats and how much the Senate and the rest of us believe the commitments he's making. How he expresses himself, will matter. And that's why I think it'll be interesting to watch.
And Lindsey Graham, who's the chairman, has said it would be a disaster for Trump to try to fire Mueller, which, again, I think, as Jeffrey says, that is, we're kind of past that issue. He said publicly he wants to make sure that Mueller's fair to Trump. And that's the concession that he wants from Barr. I'm interested to watch that exchange and sort of what are those guardrails to make sure that he's fair.
Does that include a subpoena to have Trump come answer questions, Jeffrey? Because we learned overnight that the Robert Mueller team wants to question the president again and has been rebuffed.
That is an issue that has been outstanding for a long time. It's unclear to me whether Mueller will have to go to his supervisors in the Justice Department, now Rod Rosenstein, soon to be Barr, to ask permission for a subpoena. I mean, day to day, he doesn't have to ask permission for subpoenas, but a subpoena to the president, he might have to. The issue with the subpoena, I think, for Mueller is he knows that there would be a court fight. He knows that the president's lawyers would move to quash it. There would be months of litigation, probably going all the way to the Supreme Court. Does Mueller want to put his investigation on hold while that fight plays out, or wrap up his investigation without the subpoena? I think that's the question Mueller is asking. I don't know the answer, but I think that's the question.
And look, that's why I think it's interesting that they even went back to the Trump team and said we want to talk to the president in person, knowing all that. David Gregory, Jeffrey Toobin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks.
What do we need to learn about Attorney General nominee Bill Barr? One of the senators who will be asking him questions today joins us next. In just a couple of hours, President Trump's Attorney General nominee William Barr will face questions from the Senate Judiciary Committee at his confirmation hearing, presumably tough questions. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono. She is on that committee. She will be among those asking questions. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. In regards to the Russia investigation, what will you ask the nominee?
Regarding the Russia investigation, of course, that's part and parcel of the Mueller investigation. I would want to get a very firm commitment from Mr. Barr that he will not interfere with the Mueller investigation in any way, shape, or form. And considering that Mr. Barr wrote a 19-page memo outlining how Mueller's checking into whether or not the president had engaged in obstruction of justice, that kind of investigation by Mueller had no basis. I want to make sure that he will not interfere with Mueller's continuing investigation as to whether or not the president has engaged in obstruction of justice, because that is totally contrary to what Mr. Barr wrote in his 19-page memo. So these are the kinds of very specific commitments that I would want from Mr. Barr.
So when the nominee says, and he has said, that he wants the Mueller investigation to reach its conclusion, he will not interfere, and when he says he wants the report or the results of the investigation to go public, do you believe it?
Well, that's what he's saying. So I'm going to probe that a little bit more as to what constitutes. He didn't say that he would make the report public. He said something about within the law. Yes, I would want that report to be made public. I would not want him to just summarize it. I'd want to get a very clear commitment from him that that report will be made completely public. So he's a lawyer, so he's framed his opening in certain ways that could be subject to, it sounds good, but let's face it, all of the president's nominees who come before us, many of whom, of course, the judicial nominees, many of whom have taken very strong positions on all kinds of issues, such as voting rights, women's right to choose, all of that. They've written and taken positions. Some of them have even made decisions based on their ideological perspectives, and they all come before the Judiciary Committee and say, whatever we wrote, did, said, opined upon, set that aside. I'm here to tell you I'm going to do the right thing. So, of course, we're going to have a lot of very specific questions to him.
Is there any reason that Mr. Barr has given you to not believe him when he has given you the assurances he has over the last few days?
Well, then why did he audition for this job recently? I think it's kind of unusual to have someone who just decides, well, I'm going to send a 19-page memo and I'm going to meet with some of the DOJ people as to my thoughts. He's going to share his thoughts. I think that's not terribly normal. But then we are not living in normal times. So people do all kinds of things.
I should note, he also met with some of the president's own personal lawyers, Jay Sekulow and the Raskins as well. Let me ask you about the report overnight. You're on the Armed Services Committee, where the president over the last year has been telling advisors he wants to withdraw from NATO. Do you believe that he would go through with that?
He's made it pretty plain that he's not too happy with NATO, and when you piece together all of the different statements he's made, and you know, where we ask, well, why is he doing this? And then this is why it is so not normal to have to ask, well, whose side is the president on? A Russia's side or our side? It is the accumulation of these, what seems like unusual, head-scratching, disparate kinds of utterances from him. But when you start to see a pattern where he basically spouts Putin's lines, then we have to ask the most unusual and frightening question about our own president.
The government shutdown is now in its 25th day, the longest in U.S. history. The president, we understand, is inviting some House Democrats, considered to be moderate Democrats, to come over to the White House to talk about ways to end the shutdown. Do you feel that these House members should go?
Well, they'll probably go, but we can end the shutdown right now if Mitch McConnell will bring the House-passed bills to the floor, because those bills represent a compromise already, bills that the Senate also passed last year. And so we could end the shutdown right now if Mitch McConnell would do the job as the leader of an independent branch of government and pass those bills and end this shutdown. It is Mitch McConnell who I'm looking to, because the president is so locked into his position. And as I said, he's a hostage taker. He's taken over 800,000 people hostage. And he basically, his word is not good, because he was supposed to be okaying the don't shut the government down bills that the Senate passed, and which the House we thought was going to pass. And at the last minute, watching Fox News, apparently, I don't know who's running this country, but all of a sudden he changed his mind. So any kind of meetings with the president, he can say one thing, and then hours later, I call it the Tuesday, Thursday Trump. On Tuesday, he'll tell you everything that's great, and by Thursday, it's all off the table.
Just very quickly, you blame Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell says the Democrats could end this shutdown immediately if they were to come back and say, well, $1.3 billion, $1.6 billion, some of that could go to some new border barrier.
The Democrats and all of us, the continuing assertion that the Democrats don't care about border security is so far off the mark that we have voted on various kinds of border security. And really the bottom line is that Mitch McConnell has the power. He has the power to bring these bills to the floor so we can end the shutdown. And we should be debating and discussing the border security as a separate matter, but we should not be taking 800,000 people hostage, and all of the ripple effects of that hostage taking is coming to the fore now. People having to go to food banks, scientific research being stymied. I mean, the mortgage bankers had to get a special dispensation so that they could continue to do their mortgages. So it's just crazy that we are not ending this shutdown, and Mitch McConnell has that power to do it. And I'm calling on him. I have continued to call on him to do that very thing.
Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii will be watching you and your colleagues today in this confirmation hearing for William Barr to be the next Attorney General. Thanks so much for being with us.
Morning.
John, how would the controversial memo sent by Attorney General nominee Bill Barr affect the Mueller probe? Ken Starr joins us to answer this and so much more. President Trump remains under siege after a series of bombshell reports on his meetings with Vladimir Putin and the extraordinary efforts that Mr. Trump went to conceal the details of those discussions, even from his own administration. So joining us now is Ken Starr. He's the former independent counsel who led the investigation into President Clinton. He is also the author of Contempt, a memoir of the Clinton investigation. Good morning, Judge.
Hey, good morning, Alisyn.
If you were investigating a president for some sort of inappropriate contact with a hostile foreign power, say Russia, and you found out that that president had had several meetings one-on-one with Vladimir Putin where there were no other advisors present, would alarm bells go off for you?
Well, you would certainly want to know the facts. Absolutely. The investigator's job is to gather the facts. But I gather that aspect is not going anywhere as far as we know. We have unverified reports. And I'll just say this. The underlying report, to be honest, was very distressing to me to suggest that the FBI, I think, honestly, made a terrible misjudgment to say, based upon these public statements by someone who's given to
President confiscated that interpreter's notes and swore that interpreter to secrecy. So wouldn't that arouse your suspicion?
That's a good place to start. You gather the facts, and then eventually, if you need, here's the key, and it goes to what I think Bill Barr is going to be facing today, and I think he's going to do a great job today and tomorrow. Are you going to, as an investigator, and then for Bill Barr to allow the investigator to get to the bottom of things?
Yeah.
And if this is a legitimate question, you go to the interpreter, or you take the other appropriate steps. You ask
hold on. I'm interested in this. I'm sorry to interrupt, but are you saying you could subpoena, there's a question about whether or not the committees, Democrats in Congress on foreign affairs and judiciary want to subpoena the interpreter's notes. You would support that?
I would just say you take a look at there are going to be some separation of powers issues, Alisyn, because we are talking about the presidency and so forth. But look, this will be, I think, worked out. We'll get to the bottom of this.
But how?
I thought we were going to be talking about
how, Ken? How will we get to the bottom of it?
Fact finding.
There's two people involved and only a Russian interpreter on Vladimir Putin's side. How will you ever get to the facts?
But, Alisyn, I've seen reports that Rex Tillerson was there. So let's find out what the real facts are.
Here are the real facts. Let me tell you what they are, Ken.
Okay, fair
Rex
enough.
Tillerson was involved in one of them. However, there's also this. Though the interpreter refused to discuss the meeting, officials said he conceded that Putin had denied any Russian involvement in the U.S. election and that Trump responded by saying, I believe you. That was the only thing that the interpreter said, and that, I believe, was from the Hamburg meeting. Here is also from the Hamburg meeting. Trump also had other private conversations with Putin at meetings of global leaders outside the presence of aides. He spoke at length with Putin at a banquet at the same 2017 global conference in Hamburg, where only Putin's interpreter was present. So again, Ken, how could you or the American public ever know the facts if there were only 3 people in the room and 2 of them were on Russia's side?
You inquire of the people who were there, just accepting your narrative that that's true. You go about it in a very orderly way, and you say, okay, what do you know about this? Now, let's get to this. Hold on. Let me finish. Alisyn, let me finish. So eventually you're saying, do you need to subpoena the President of the United States? That's a very weighty issue that either Bob Mueller or whomever, and it may be a political issue for the House or for the Senate, but it's a conclusion that will eventually be made. To subpoena the President is a very serious act, but it is known in our law. We subpoenaed President Clinton, and I think you know that.
I remember.
But we did that only as, I'm sorry?
I remember, and you think that we're at that point with President Trump?
That I don't know. I don't know all the facts. What I do know is in our investigation, we asked a number of times politely, we need the president's testimony. There's a process. So let's allow that process to unfold. It apparently is unfolding if this issue that you're talking about is actually on the table.
Well, listen, I mean, there's a couple of things here. So I'm still unclear about how you would ever gather the facts and get to the bottom of it, since President Trump hasn't been forthcoming about what was said in those meetings. Vladimir Putin certainly isn't forthcoming about what was been said at those meetings. And the interpreter's notes were confiscated and sworn to secrecy. So if you're saying that now it's up to Robert Mueller to subpoena the president, hold on one second. As you know, President Trump answered written questions, and those were apparently didn't go far enough. The latest reporting is that Robert Mueller has more questions. Those begged more questions. So are we at the point where it's time for Robert Mueller to subpoena President Trump?
That's an ultimate judgment for Bob, and I can't, for Bob Mueller, and I can't substitute myself for that. But I will tell you this, knowing Bob Mueller, he will not be rushing into anything, nor will he be fearful of doing whatever he thinks he needs to do professionally with integrity to get to the bottom of things. And by the way, that's the same thing I would say about Bill Barr, with whom I served. Bill Barr is a person of complete integrity who does indeed have very strong views with which I share about the protection of the prerogatives of the presidency in our separation of powers system. Congress has powers, but so does the president. And the founding generation warned us about constant intrusions by Congress into the prerogatives of the president. That's really what the Barr memorandum ultimately was all about, as I read the memo.
And so since he called it in his memo, that 19-page memo, since he called it fatally misconceived, the investigation into obstruction of justice, if today he says, as he's expected to, yes, he'll get out of Robert Mueller's way and it can conclude on its own in its logical conclusion, and that he thinks it should go forward, which Bill Barr is to be believed?
First, his analysis of the memorandum of the particular statute of obstruction of justice was devastatingly correct, spot on. But we can litigate that separately. But here's the key point for the American people. Bill Barr is a person of integrity. He will be taking an oath, and then he will be operating, when he's confirmed, as I'm confident that he will, he'll be operating under the existent regulations. It's not just his word, but he's a person of the law, and those regulations under which Bob Mueller was appointed, they've been in place for over 20 years, as you know, guarantee the independence of those day-to-day judgments. Now, there will be issues that Bill Barr should be looking at, such as an issue of subpoenaing the president.
Ken Starr, we thank you. You know more about all of this stuff than most anyone. Thank you for sharing your perspective on this. John.
My pleasure.
88 Days of Horror, we are learning disturbing details of how Jamie Kloss was abducted and her months in captivity. We have a live report now finding new details in the kidnapping of Jamie Kloss. Investigators say the 21-year-old suspect told them he first spotted Kloss getting into a school bus and decided she was the girl he was going to take. He did not even know her name. CNET's Gene Casares is live in Barron, Wisconsin with the very latest. Gene, this is just awful, awful stuff.
It is. It's unbelievable, and we did not know these facts until that complaint came out yesterday, and the defendant is being held on $5 million bond in the local jail right behind me. But what we learned from the complaint, and he is charged with 2 counts of intentional homicide, first degree, 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of armed robbery. But after he saw her on that school bus, about 2.5 weeks later, he started making trips to the house to go in the home to capture her. He went to Walmart and he purchased a mask. He got a black jacket, 2 pairs of work gloves, steel boots. He took a shower before he went on the 3rd time that he went over, which actually is when he captured her. And he shaved his head to make sure there was no DNA at the scene. He found his father's shotgun. He wiped it down. He wiped down the shells. He was ready, he said. And he knew that this was the girl he wanted to get. When he walked up to the house and he pulled up in the car, it was Jamie that woke up because her dog was barking talking, and she looked out and she saw someone in the driveway in a car. She woke her parents up. Her father went to the front door. He had a flashlight shining out. The defendant said, according to the complaint, that he saw that flashlight. He walked up, he yelled to the man to get down, and her father didn't do that. So he took that shotgun and he fired one shot through the glass and he went down. He killed him, one shot to the head. He made his way in the house. He looked through the rooms. He saw one door that was locked. It was barricaded. He pushed and pushed and pushed his way in. That was the bathroom. The shower curtain was drawn, and Jamie and her mother were holding each other in the shower. One shot to her mother's head. She was duct taped, put in the car, driven, she thinks, 2 hours to the cabin where she stayed for 3 months. And she was many times for hours under a bed so she could not escape. When she finally decided he was gone, she was going to run for it, she got out from under the bed. She went out to the street. A lady with a dog found her, took her to a home, listened to the 911 call that happened minutes after she was found.
Douglas County 911.
Hi. I have a young lady at my house right now, and she says her name is Jamie Kloss.
Okay, have you seen her photo, ma'am?
Yes, it is her. I 100% think it is her.
Okay.
100%. So we're kind of scared because he might come.
Yep.
So if the cops could get here soon, we would love.
I have many deputies headed that way. I'm going to keep you on the line.
Okay.
And she said, I am Jamie Kloss.
Yes. She said, he killed my parents. I want to go home. Help me.
Alisyn, at the initial appearance yesterday, Jamie's family en masse were on one side of the courtroom. The other side, a man and a younger man who we have now confirmed was the father of the defendant. When the defendant's face came on that screen in the courtroom, his father began to sob, and buried his head into the shoulder of his son. It was too much for him to watch. Alisyn?
Oh my gosh, Jean, it is all so shocking. Thank you very much for all that reporting. Let's discuss it now with Greg McCrary. He is a former FBI profiler. Greg, thank you so much for being here. What Jean has just described about what Jamie endured is chilling. The details get more and more shocking. Tell us, from what you've heard, what you make of this suspect.